The young boy who once hid behind his mother's dress during royal ceremonies now stands tall at 12 years old, his eyes scanning the crowd with a confidence that seems far beyond his years. Prince George Alexander Louis, third in line to the British throne, has begun to understand the weight of his destiny in ways that would make even seasoned adults pause. As 2025 unfolds, the British royal family faces its most transformative year yet, with King Charles III proving that duty never sleeps and his grandson George showing glimpses of the future monarch he will one day become. This is not just another year in the life of the Windsor family. This is the year when tradition meets evolution, when a grandfather's unwavering commitment to service becomes the foundation for his grandson's emerging sense of purpose. From the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace to the windswept moors of Scotland, from state banquets with world leaders to quiet family moments that shape a future king, 2025 has become a defining chapter in the modern British monarchy. What happens when a 12-year-old prince begins to truly understand his role in history? How does a king in his 70s balance the demands of a changing world while preparing the next generation for leadership? The answers lie in the extraordinary events, private conversations, and public moments that have made 2025 a year unlike any other for the House of Windsor. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Prince George walked alongside his grandfather, King Charles III, their footsteps echoing softly on the ancient stone pathways. It was early March 2025, and the young prince had just returned from his half-term break at Lambrook School, his mind still buzzing with excitement from his history lessons about British monarchs. What he didn't know was that this particular morning would mark the beginning of his real education in what it meant to be royal. King Charles, now in his second full year of reign, had been planning this conversation for months. The monarch had watched his grandson grow from a shy toddler who once threw tantrums at royal events into a thoughtful young man who asked probing questions about everything from climate change to constitutional monarchy. The time had come, Charles believed, to begin preparing George for the responsibilities that would one day rest on his shoulders. As they paused beside the round tower, Charles pointed toward the flag flying overhead. "Do you know what that represents, George?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of decades of royal service. The young prince studied the royal standard fluttering in the morning breeze, its vibrant colors catching the light. "It means you're here, Grandpapa," George replied confidently. "But it also means something more, doesn't it?" Charles smiled, recognizing in his grandson the same curiosity that had driven him throughout his own life. "It represents continuity," the king explained. "Every time that flag flies, it tells the people of our realm that the monarchy endures, that there is stability in an ever-changing world. One day, George, a similar flag will fly because of you." The weight of those words settled over the 12-year-old like a ceremonial robe. George had always known he would be king someday, but it had seemed as distant and abstract as the history lessons he studied at school. Now, standing in the shadow of nearly 1,000 years of royal history, the reality began to take shape in his young mind. Throughout the spring of 2025, King Charles made a conscious decision to include George in more royal activities, not as a participant but as an observer and student. The king's daily schedule was a masterclass in modern monarchy, balancing ancient traditions with contemporary challenges. George watched as his grandfather reviewed government papers each morning, the famous red boxes containing state secrets and policy decisions that affected millions of lives. "Why do you read everything so carefully, Grandpapa?" George asked one morning as Charles worked through a particularly thick bundle of documents from the Foreign Office. The king looked up from a briefing about international trade agreements, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "Because every decision, every word, every action of the sovereign has consequences," Charles explained. "The people trust us with their democracy, their traditions, their future. We cannot take that lightly." The lesson extended beyond the private study. When Charles attended the state opening of Parliament in May 2025, George watched from the gallery as his grandfather delivered the Queen's speech, outlining the government's legislative agenda. The pomp and ceremony that had once seemed merely decorative to the young prince now revealed itself as something deeper, a complex ballet of constitutional democracy played out in ermine and gold. George began to understand that his grandfather's role was not about power in the traditional sense, but about service and symbolism. When Charles met with Prime Minister in their weekly audiences, the conversations were about guidance and counsel, not commands and decrees. The king listened more than he spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and offered perspective gained from decades of experience. The education was not confined to formal state business. Charles made sure that George witnessed the full spectrum of royal duty, from the grand to the intimate. They visited a children's hospital in Birmingham where Charles had been patron for over 30 years. George watched as his grandfather spent genuine time with each young patient, remembering names and asking about treatments, bringing comfort that had nothing to do with crowns or protocol. "How do you remember everyone's name?" George whispered as they walked between wards. Charles paused beside a window overlooking the hospital's healing garden, a space he had helped design years earlier. "Because they're not just subjects or citizens," he said quietly. "They're individuals with hopes and fears and dreams. Our role is to remind them that they matter, that their sovereign sees them as people, not just numbers." The summer months brought Trooping the Color, and, for the first time, George participated in the ceremony with a deeper understanding of its significance. As he stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, watching the precision of the household division and listening to the roar of RAF jets overhead, he felt the connection between past and future that his grandfather had tried to explain. The crowds below looked up at the royal family with a mixture of reverence and affection that George was beginning to appreciate. These weren't just spectators at a show, they were people who saw the monarchy as part of their national identity, a link to history and tradition that provided stability in an uncertain world. During their summer stay at Balmoral, the education continued in a more relaxed setting. Charles shared stories of his own childhood, of learning from his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and his father, Prince Philip. The lessons were woven into daily activities, from morning walks across the Scottish Highlands to evening conversations by the fireplace. "Your great-grandmother used to tell me that the crown is not a privilege but a responsibility," Charles said one evening as they sat overlooking the River Dee. "She understood that every generation must earn anew the respect and trust of the people. It cannot be taken for granted." George absorbed these lessons with the seriousness of a child who was beginning to understand that his future was not entirely his own. Yet Charles was careful to balance the weight of duty with the freedom of childhood. There were still moments for football matches, fishing expeditions, and the kind of grandfather-grandson adventures that had nothing to do with constitutional monarchy. As autumn approached, George returned to school with a changed perspective. His classmates still saw him as simply another student, but he now carried within him a growing awareness of the role he would one day inherit. His teachers noticed a new thoughtfulness in his approach to history and current events, a depth of questioning that suggested he was connecting classroom learning with real-world responsibility. The transformation was not lost on his parents, Prince William and Catherine. They had watched their eldest son's gradual awakening to his royal destiny with a mixture of pride and protective concern. William, who had walked a similar path decades earlier, understood the delicate balance between preparing for kingship and preserving childhood innocence. In October, George accompanied his grandfather to a Commonwealth reception at Buckingham Palace, his first formal introduction to the international family of nations that would one day look to him for leadership. As he was introduced to prime ministers, presidents, and governors-general from across the Commonwealth realms, George began to grasp the global nature of his future responsibilities. The conversations were brief and carefully managed, but they provided glimpses into the complex web of relationships that define modern monarchy. When the Prime Minister of Canada mentioned the upcoming royal tour plan for 2026, George realized that his education was about to extend far beyond the borders of the United Kingdom. By the end of 2025, the transformation in Prince George was remarkable. The boy who had begun the year as a schoolchild with a distant understanding of his royal future had evolved into a young man with a genuine appreciation for the weight and wonder of constitutional monarchy. He had witnessed his grandfather's dedication to duty, his careful balance of tradition and modernization, his genuine care for the people he served. King Charles, observing his grandson's development, felt a deep satisfaction. The careful cultivation of understanding that he had begun that March morning at Windsor Castle had taken root. George was still very much a 12-year-old boy, with all the energy and curiosity that entailed, but he was also becoming something more, a future king who would inherit not just a crown but a profound sense of purpose. The year 2025 would be remembered as the time when Prince George truly began his journey toward kingship, guided by a grandfather whose own commitment to duty had never wavered. As the year drew to a close, both the current king and the future king understood that they had participated in something precious, the passing of wisdom and responsibility from one generation to the next, ensuring that the monarchy would continue to serve with dignity and purpose for generations to come. The phone call came at 6:30 in the morning, jolting King Charles from his carefully structured morning routine. The voice on the other end belonged to the cabinet secretary, and the words that followed would define much of what made 2025 a year of unprecedented royal duty. A devastating earthquake had struck the Eastern Caribbean, affecting several Commonwealth realms, and the international community was looking to Britain for leadership in the humanitarian response. Within hours, Charles had transformed from grandfather figure guiding young Prince George into the decisive head of state that the crisis demanded. The king's study at Buckingham Palace became a command center, with private secretaries coordinating between government ministers, Commonwealth leaders, and international aid organizations. George, who had been scheduled for another of their educational walks, instead found himself witnessing monarchy in action during a genuine emergency. "This is what duty really means," Charles explained to his grandson as they walked quickly toward the throne room where emergency meetings would take place throughout the day. "Sometimes the crown is ceremonial, sometimes it's symbolic, but sometimes it becomes the focal point for a nation's response to crisis. Today is one of those days." The next 72 hours showcased King Charles at his most effective. Years of environmental advocacy had connected him with disaster relief networks worldwide, and his personal relationships with Commonwealth leaders proved invaluable in coordinating rapid response efforts. George watched as his grandfather worked the phones, speaking with prime ministers, presidents, and aid coordinators with a combination of royal authority and genuine personal concern. The young prince observed something remarkable during those intense days. While government ministers handled the technical aspects of the relief effort, his grandfather served as both catalyst and conscience, pushing for faster action while ensuring that the human cost of the disaster remained at the forefront of every decision. When one official suggested delaying certain aid shipments due to logistical concerns, Charles's response was swift and unmistakable. "Every hour we delay means families waiting for clean water, for medical supplies, for hope," the king said firmly. "Find a way to make it work. That is not a request." George had never heard his grandfather speak with such steel in his voice, yet it was steel tempered by compassion, authority exercised in service of others. The crisis response revealed layers of royal duty that George had never considered. Charles personally telephoned other world leaders, leveraging relationships built over decades of diplomatic service to secure additional aid and resources. The king's network of charitable organizations, many of which he had supported for years, became crucial components of the relief infrastructure. When Charles announced a personal donation from the privy purse to the relief effort, followed by the establishment of a new royal foundation specifically for disaster response, George began to understand how personal wealth and public position could be wielded for humanitarian purposes. "We don't just symbolize the nation," Charles explained. "We must sometimes lead by example, showing what service really means." The international response to the king's leadership during the Caribbean crisis established 2025 as a watershed moment for the modern monarchy. World leaders who had sometimes viewed the British crown as an anachronistic institution found themselves dealing with a head of state whose experience, connections, and genuine commitment made him an invaluable partner in crisis management. As spring progressed into summer, the pace of royal engagements intensified rather than decreased. Charles seemed energized by the crisis response, determined to demonstrate that constitutional monarchy could be both relevant and vital in addressing contemporary challenges. George continued his education by accompanying his grandfather to increasingly significant events, watching as the king balanced ceremonial duties with substantive leadership. The state visit from the President of France in June provided George with a masterclass in royal diplomacy. He observed from discreet vantage points as Charles navigated complex conversations about trade relationships, environmental cooperation, and international security. The formal dinners and ceremonies that had once seemed merely decorative revealed themselves as carefully orchestrated opportunities for relationship building and policy advancement. "Watch how every gesture matters," Charles advised his grandson before a crucial dinner at the Palace of Versailles during the return visit to France. "The way we greet dignitaries, the topics we choose for conversation, even where people sit at dinner, all of these things communicate messages about Britain's relationships with other nations. Protocol is diplomacy made visible." During their visit to France, George experienced his first taste of international royal duty. While his participation was limited and carefully managed, he attended several youth-focused events, meeting with French students and participating in environmental education programs. The young prince discovered that his royal status opened doors and created opportunities for meaningful dialogue about issues that mattered to his generation. The French press took notice of George's emerging confidence and natural ability to connect with young people from different backgrounds. Photographs of the 12-year-old prince discussing climate change with French students, speaking in careful but enthusiastic French, began appearing in newspapers across Europe. For the first time, international media started portraying George not just as a cute royal child but as a future leader already beginning to engage with global issues. Back in Britain, Charles used the momentum from successful international engagements to tackle domestic challenges with renewed vigor. The king's annual garden parties, normally pleasant but relatively routine affairs, became forums for addressing pressing social issues. Charles made a point of inviting guests who represented different aspects of British society, from teachers and healthcare workers to small business owners and environmental activists. George attended these events as both observer and participant, gradually learning how to navigate conversations with people from vastly different backgrounds. His grandfather coached him on the art of meaningful small talk, teaching him how to ask questions that showed genuine interest and how to remember details that could be referenced in future meetings. "People don't expect us to have all the answers," Charles explained after one particularly successful garden party. "They expect us to care about the right questions, to listen when they speak, and to remember that their concerns matter. That's how we earn the right to wear the crown." The summer also brought a significant moment in George's development when Charles decided to include him in private audiences with government ministers. The young prince sat quietly in the corner of the king's study, listening as his grandfather met with the Chancellor of the Exchequer about economic policy, with the Foreign Secretary about international relations, and with various other officials about the full range of government business. These meetings revealed the true nature of constitutional monarchy in action. Charles never told ministers what to do, but his questions were pointed and his observations were often insightful. Years of experience had given him a perspective that purely political figures sometimes lacked, and his role as constitutional sovereign allowed him to speak truths that others might find diplomatically difficult to express. George began to understand that effective constitutional monarchy required a delicate balance of engagement and restraint. His grandfather had opinions about policy, clear preferences about direction, and strong feelings about priorities, but he expressed these through questions, suggestions, and the careful use of royal influence rather than direct commands. The autumn months brought new challenges that tested both Charles's experience and George's growing understanding. A series of strikes across public services threatened to paralyze the country, and various groups looked to the palace for leadership during the crisis. Charles navigated these dangerous waters with particular care, understanding that any perceived taking of sides could damage the monarchy's constitutional position. Instead, the king focused on bringing people together, hosting informal meetings between union leaders and government officials, providing neutral ground for conversations that might not otherwise have happened. George watched these efforts with fascination, learning how royal influence could be exercised through convening power rather than directive authority. When resolution finally came to the strike crisis, much of the credit went to the government's negotiation skills and the union's willingness to compromise. But those close to the process understood that Charles's behind-the-scenes facilitation had been crucial in creating the conditions for successful dialogue. The king had demonstrated once again that constitutional monarchy could provide valuable service without overstepping constitutional boundaries. As 2025 drew toward its close, the intensity of royal duty showed no signs of decreasing. Charles maintained a schedule that would challenge someone half his age, driven by a sense of purpose that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker with time. George continued to accompany his grandfather when appropriate, gradually building his own understanding of what service to the realm actually meant. The year had proven that duty, for this king, was not a burden to be endured but a calling to be embraced. Whether responding to international crises, conducting delicate diplomacy, or simply providing stability during domestic uncertainty, Charles had shown that constitutional monarchy could be both traditional and vital, both ceremonial and substantive. For George, watching his grandfather's commitment to service throughout 2025 had been the most valuable education possible. The future king was learning that wearing the crown meant accepting responsibility for something larger than oneself, something that connected past to future and individual to nation. It was a lesson that would shape not just his understanding of monarchy but his development as a person who would one day carry that same burden of service forward into an uncertain future. The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, carried by special courier to Buckingham Palace and marked with the highest security classification. King Charles read it twice before setting it down on his desk with hands that trembled slightly, not from age but from the magnitude of what he had just learned. Intelligence services had uncovered a credible terrorist threat targeting the upcoming Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, scheduled to take place in London in November. The information was specific, the danger was real, and the decision about whether to proceed with the summit now rested largely with the Crown. Prince George was reviewing his French homework in the adjoining study when his grandfather called him in, the boy immediately sensing the gravity of the situation from the king's expression. Charles had made a conscious decision throughout 2025 to shield George from the darker aspects of royal responsibility, but this moment demanded a different approach. The future king needed to understand that duty sometimes meant making decisions where every option carried significant risk. "George, I need to share something with you that will test everything we've discussed about service and responsibility," Charles began, his voice carrying a weight that made the 12-year-old straighten in his chair. "Intelligence suggests that dangerous people want to use next month's Commonwealth Summit to cause harm. The question facing me is whether we cancel the meeting, showing that threats can disrupt our democratic processes, or whether we proceed, accepting increased risk to demonstrate that terrorism cannot dictate our actions." The young prince listened with the focused attention that had become characteristic of his royal education throughout the year. He asked questions about security measures, about the importance of the Commonwealth meeting, about the precedent that either decision would set. Charles answered honestly, treating his grandson not as a child to be protected but as a future sovereign who needed to understand the complexity of leadership during genuine crisis. Over the following days, Buckingham Palace became the center of intense security planning and diplomatic consultation. George observed as his grandfather worked with intelligence chiefs, government ministers, and Commonwealth representatives to assess options and develop contingency plans. The king's approach was methodical and collaborative, seeking input from every relevant expert while maintaining clear awareness that the final decision would ultimately rest with the crown. The young prince watched his grandfather wrestle with the fundamental tension between safety and symbolism. Canceling the summit would protect lives but might encourage future threats by demonstrating that terrorism could achieve its goals. Proceeding with enhanced security would send a message of strength but could put dozens of world leaders, including Charles himself, at genuine risk. "How do you make a decision when you can't be certain of the outcome?" George asked one evening as they walked through the palace gardens, surrounded by security personnel whose presence had become much more obvious in recent days. Charles paused beside the lake, watching swans glide across water that reflected the autumn sky. "You gather all available information, consult with people you trust, consider the long-term consequences of each option, and then, you decide based on your best understanding of what serves the greater good," he replied. Sometimes being king means accepting responsibility for outcomes you cannot control. The decision, when it came, reflected Charles's deepest convictions about duty and democracy. The Commonwealth Summit would proceed as scheduled, with security measures that would make it one of the most protected gatherings in British history. The king announced his decision personally, explaining to the nation that yielding to terrorist threats would undermine the very democratic values that the Commonwealth existed to promote. George watched the announcement being recorded, seeing his grandfather transform from the conflicted man who had shared his doubts privately into the confident sovereign who spoke to the nation about resolve and resilience. It was a masterclass in leadership under pressure, demonstrating how personal uncertainty could coexist with public authority when the situation demanded clear direction. The weeks leading up to the summit tested everyone involved. Security sweeps, background checks, and coordination with international protection services created an atmosphere of controlled tension throughout London. George's own schedule was quietly adjusted to ensure he would be at Windsor Castle during the most vulnerable periods, though he continued his education through video calls and secured communications with his grandfather. When the Commonwealth Summit finally convened, it did so under unprecedented security but with a sense of triumph that resonated throughout the international community. World leaders praised Charles's decision to proceed, recognizing that the king had taken a principled stand that strengthened democratic resolve globally. The meetings themselves were productive, addressing climate change, economic cooperation, and security challenges with renewed energy driven by the shared experience of refusing to bow to intimidation. George followed the proceedings from Windsor, watching his grandfather chair sessions and facilitate discussions between leaders who brought vastly different perspectives to shared challenges. The young prince began to understand how Commonwealth leadership required not just ceremonial presence but genuine diplomatic skill and the ability to find common ground among diverse voices. The summit concluded without incident, the threatened attacks having been disrupted by security operations that remained largely invisible to the public. Charles's gamble had paid off, but, more importantly, his decision had demonstrated that constitutional monarchy could provide steady leadership during periods of genuine uncertainty. The international press coverage was overwhelmingly positive, portraying the king as a leader who had refused to let fear dictate policy. In the aftermath of the summit's success, George rejoined his grandfather for what had become their traditional evening conversations. The young prince had questions about everything from security protocols to diplomatic etiquette, but his deepest curiosity centered on how his grandfather had managed the psychological pressure of making decisions with life and death consequences. "I was terrified," Charles admitted with characteristic honesty. Every leader who claims they don't feel fear during genuine crisis is either lying or lacks proper understanding of what's at stake. But fear cannot paralyze you when others depend on your leadership. You acknowledge the fear, you use it to sharpen your focus, and then you do what needs to be done. The conversation marked another milestone in George's education, the moment when he began to understand that courage was not the absence of fear but the willingness to act correctly despite fear. His grandfather had shown him that even kings experienced doubt and anxiety, but that royal duty demanded action based on principle rather than comfort. As November progressed, the successful summit created momentum for other challenging initiatives. Charles used his enhanced international standing to launch a new environmental program connecting Commonwealth nations in shared climate action. George participated in the announcement ceremony, his first formal role in a major policy initiative, reading a brief statement about youth engagement in environmental protection. The experience of speaking publicly about issues that mattered to him gave George new insight into how royal platform could amplify important messages. His carefully crafted remarks about young people's stake in environmental action received positive coverage across Commonwealth media, establishing him as an emerging voice for his generation's concerns. December brought reflection on a year that had tested the monarchy's relevance and proven its resilience. The successful navigation of international crisis, domestic challenges, and security threats had demonstrated that Charles's vision of active constitutional monarchy could provide genuine value in addressing contemporary problems. George had witnessed firsthand how duty, properly understood and courageously executed, could make meaningful difference in the world. The young prince spent the final weeks of 2025 processing everything he had learned, from the basic mechanics of constitutional government to the complex psychology of leadership under pressure. His grandfather had provided an education that no classroom could replicate, showing him through direct experience what it meant to serve something larger than oneself. When they gathered for Christmas at Sandringham, the royal family reflected on a year that would be remembered as pivotal in the modern monarchy's development. Charles had proven that age brought wisdom rather than weakness, that experience enabled effective leadership during genuine crisis. George had evolved from curious child into emerging leader, gaining understanding of royal responsibility that would shape his character for decades to come. The lessons of 2025 had been written not in textbooks but in real decisions with real consequences. George had learned that monarchy meant service, that service required sacrifice, and that sacrifice could yield profound satisfaction when it contributed to the greater good. These were lessons that would guide him as he continued growing toward the crown that would one day be his own. As the year concluded, both current king and future king understood that they had shared something precious and irreplaceable. Charles had passed on not just knowledge but wisdom, not just information but understanding. George had received an education in leadership that would serve him well when his own time came to bear the weight of crown and duty. The monarchy had proven its continuing relevance by meeting contemporary challenges with ancient wisdom and modern courage, ensuring its vital role in the nation's future. The diagnosis came on a cold February morning that would forever divide 2025 into before and after. King Charles sat in the private office of his personal physician at the London clinic, Prince George beside him at the king's specific request, both listening to words that would reshape everything they thought they knew about duty, time, and the nature of service. The cancer had been caught early, the treatment outlook was promising, but the months ahead would require a different kind of courage than either of them had yet been asked to demonstrate. George's first reaction was the pure fear of a child who suddenly understood that his grandfather was not invincible. The 12-year-old had watched Charles navigate international crises and domestic challenges with seemingly endless energy and wisdom, and the revelation of human vulnerability struck him with unexpected force. Charles, observing his grandson's reaction, made an immediate decision that would define how they approached the difficult months ahead. "This changes nothing about our duty," the king said quietly, taking George's hand as they sat in the medical consultation room. "It changes how we fulfill that duty, perhaps the timeline we work within, but not the fundamental obligation we have to serve. If anything, George, this reminds us that every day we have the privilege of service is precious and should not be wasted." The decision to include George in the medical consultation reflected Charles's evolved approach to preparing his grandson for royal responsibility. Throughout 2025, the king had gradually exposed the young prince to more complex and challenging aspects of monarchy, but facing personal mortality while maintaining public duty represented the ultimate test of royal character. Over the following weeks, as Charles began treatment while maintaining a modified schedule of royal engagements, George witnessed something remarkable. Rather than diminishing his grandfather's commitment to service, the cancer diagnosis seemed to intensify it. Charles approached each public appearance, each meeting with government officials, each charitable engagement with renewed focus and purpose. "I used to think I had unlimited time to accomplish everything I hoped to achieve," Charles explained to George as they reviewed the modified calendar of events for the spring months. "Now I understand that time is a gift that should never be taken for granted. Every speech, every meeting, every moment we have to make a positive difference becomes more precious when you realize how finite our opportunities really are." The treatment schedule required careful coordination with royal duties, but Charles refused to let medical appointments dictate his service to the nation. Instead, he worked with his private secretaries to create a framework that honored both his health needs and his constitutional responsibilities. George accompanied his grandfather to treatment sessions when appropriate, observing how royal dignity could be maintained even in the most humble circumstances. During one particularly difficult treatment period, when Charles was weakened by chemotherapy but still insisted on attending an important charitable function, George asked the question that had been troubling him for weeks. "Why don't you just rest, Grandpapa? Everyone would understand if you took time away from public duties to focus on getting better." Charles's response revealed depths of understanding about monarchy that went far beyond constitutional theory. "The crown is not something you wear only when it's convenient or comfortable," he said, adjusting his tie before entering the charity gala despite obvious fatigue. "People don't choose their difficulties or their timing. They face challenges when they come, and they need to know that their institutions, including the monarchy, will remain steady regardless of personal circumstances. If I only served when I felt perfectly well, what message would that send about dedication and reliability?" The lesson resonated with George in ways that would influence his character for the rest of his life. He watched his grandfather demonstrate that true leadership meant showing up especially when it was difficult, that duty transcended personal comfort or convenience. The young prince began to understand that wearing the crown meant accepting responsibility that didn't pause for illness, exhaustion, or personal crisis. As Charles's treatment progressed through the spring and summer months, the modified royal schedule became an opportunity for different types of engagement. Unable to maintain his previous pace of travel and public appearances, the king focused more intensively on one-on-one meetings, private consultations, and behind-the-scenes work that rarely received public attention but formed the crucial foundation of constitutional monarchy. George participated in many of these quieter activities, learning how much of royal service happened away from cameras and public ceremony. He sat in on meetings between his grandfather and charity leaders, watched Charles review and comment on government papers despite treatment fatigue, and observed the careful balance of rest and duty that marked this phase of the king's reign. The experience provided George with a different model of leadership than he had witnessed earlier in the year. While Charles's response to international crises had demonstrated monarchy's capacity for dynamic action, his approach to personal illness showed how duty could be fulfilled through persistence, dignity, and quiet determination even when physical energy was limited. The summer months brought encouraging medical news, with treatment proving more effective than initially hoped. But, rather than returning immediately to his previous intense schedule, Charles used his recovery period to deepen George's education in subtler aspects of royal responsibility. They spent long hours at Balmoral discussing the history of the monarchy, the evolution of constitutional principles, and the delicate relationships between crown, parliament, and people. "Your great-grandmother faced much more serious challenges than cancer," Charles reminded George as they walked through the Scottish Highlands where Queen Elizabeth II had found peace and perspective during her own difficult periods. Wars, constitutional crises, personal tragedies that would have broken lesser spirits. But she understood that the monarchy must endure regardless of personal circumstances. That legacy is what we inherit, and what we must pass forward. These conversations at Balmoral provided George with historical context for contemporary challenges. Charles shared stories of previous monarchs who had faced adversity with grace, demonstrating how personal difficulties could sometimes strengthen rather than weaken royal character. The young prince learned that resilience was not just a personal virtue but a constitutional necessity. As autumn arrived and Charles's health continued to improve, the king made a decision that surprised many observers. Instead of immediately resuming his full schedule of activities, he chose to maintain a more sustainable pace that would allow for long-term service rather than short-term intensity. The lesson for George was profound: effective leadership sometimes meant accepting limitations in order to ensure longevity. "I could try to do everything I did before, but that might risk my ability to serve for years to come," Charles explained as they planned the autumn calendar. Real duty sometimes means accepting that you cannot do everything you want to do, but committing to do what you can do as well as possible for as long as possible. The modified approach proved remarkably effective. With fewer but more focused engagements, Charles's public appearances carried additional weight and significance. His speeches gained power from the obvious determination required to deliver them. His presence at events became more meaningful because everyone understood the effort involved. George observed how his grandfather's cancer experience had changed not just the king's approach to duty but the public's relationship with the monarchy. There was new appreciation for Charles's dedication, new understanding of the personal sacrifices involved in royal service. The diagnosis had humanized the crown in ways that no public relations strategy could have achieved. When Charles delivered his Christmas message in December 2025, he spoke directly about the year's challenges and lessons. George watched from the recording studio as his grandfather addressed the nation about duty, resilience, and the preciousness of time. The message was personal yet universal, royal yet relatable, demonstrating how individual experience could illuminate broader truths. "This year has reminded me that none of us knows how much time we have to make a positive difference in the world," Charles said, looking directly into the camera with the authority of someone who had faced mortality while maintaining service. "But we do know that every day we are given is an opportunity to serve something larger than ourselves, to contribute to the common good, to leave the world a little better than we found it." For George, watching that Christmas message being recorded represented the culmination of a year of education unlike anything he could have imagined. He had seen his grandfather face international crisis, navigate security threats, manage domestic challenges, and confront personal illness, all while maintaining unwavering commitment to constitutional duty and public service. The year 2025 had taught both of them that duty was not about perfection but about persistence, not about avoiding difficulty but about facing it with dignity. Charles had shown that true leadership meant serving others even when personal circumstances made service challenging, while George had learned that preparing for kingship meant developing the character to maintain commitment regardless of obstacles. As the year concluded, grandfather and grandson understood that they had shared something unprecedented in the modern monarchy. Charles had demonstrated what it truly meant to wear the crown during a time of personal trial, while George had gained insight into the depths of dedication that royal service required. The lessons learned would influence both of their approaches to duty for the rest of their lives, ensuring that the monarchy's commitment to service would continue to evolve while remaining unshakable in its fundamental purpose. The final weeks of December 2025 brought an unexpected invitation that would serve as the perfect capstone to a year of extraordinary royal education. The Prime Minister requested a private meeting with King Charles and Prince George together, a constitutional first that reflected the unique circumstances of the year and the growing recognition of George's emerging role in the monarchy's future. The meeting, held in the oak-panelled study at Buckingham Palace, would address challenges facing Britain in 2026 and beyond, providing George with his first formal consultation on matters of state. As they prepared for the meeting, Charles reminded his grandson of everything they had learned together throughout the remarkable year behind them. "Today, George, you stop being just an observer of constitutional monarchy and begin participating in it," the king said, adjusting his grandson's tie with the same care he had shown during their very first educational walk at Windsor Castle nearly 10 months earlier. "Remember that our role is to listen, to counsel, and to provide perspective that transcends party politics and short-term thinking." The Prime Minister arrived precisely at the appointed time, accompanied by the Cabinet Secretary and a small team of advisors. The formality of the occasion was balanced by the genuine warmth between the political and royal leadership, relationships that had been strengthened throughout the year's various challenges. George took his seat beside his grandfather, trying to project the dignity expected of a future king while managing the excitement of participating in genuine constitutional business. The discussion that followed provided George with the most sophisticated lesson in practical monarchy he had yet received. The Prime Minister outlined economic challenges that would require difficult decisions, international relationships that needed careful management, and domestic policies that would affect millions of lives. Throughout the conversation, Charles demonstrated the art of constitutional consultation, asking probing questions, offering historical perspective, and providing guidance that remained strictly within constitutional bounds. When the Prime Minister specifically asked for George's thoughts on youth engagement with democratic institutions, the young prince found himself speaking not as a child but as a representative of his generation's concerns and aspirations. His comments about climate change, education, and digital democracy were brief but thoughtful, demonstrating the maturity he had developed through months of careful mentoring. "Your Royal Highness has clearly inherited the family gift for asking the right questions at the right time," the Prime Minister observed after George had spoken. The comment, though formally polite, carried genuine appreciation for insights that bridged generational perspectives. For George, it was confirmation that his year of education had prepared him to contribute meaningfully to constitutional dialogue. After the meeting concluded, Charles and George walked through the palace gardens despite the winter chill, both needing time to process the significance of what had just occurred. The transition from observer to participant marked a new phase in George's preparation for eventual kingship, one that would require even greater sophistication and understanding than anything the year had yet demanded. "How do you balance giving your honest opinion with staying above politics?" George asked as they paused beside the lake where swans moved gracefully through water that reflected the gray December sky. Charles smiled at the question, recognizing the growing complexity of his grandson's thinking. "You focus on principles rather than parties, on long-term consequences rather than short-term advantages, on what serves the nation rather than what serves any particular group," he replied. "Constitutional monarchy works because we represent continuity and national unity, not political positions." The final royal engagement of 2025 came on New Year's Eve, when Charles and George together attended a reception for diplomatic corps, representing not just the current state of the monarchy but its future direction. Foreign ambassadors and high commissioners who had observed George's development throughout the year noted his transformation from curious child into emerging leader, his growing confidence in representing Britain's values and interests. During the reception, George had his first extensive conversations with foreign diplomats as a semi-official representative of the royal family. His discussions with the Canadian High Commissioner about Commonwealth youth initiatives, his conversation with the French ambassador about environmental cooperation, and his exchange with the German ambassador about educational partnerships demonstrated remarkable sophistication for a 12-year-old. Charles watched these interactions with deep satisfaction, seeing his grandson naturally embody the qualities that made constitutional monarchy effective: genuine interest in others, careful listening, thoughtful questions, and the ability to find common ground across different perspectives. The year of intensive education had prepared George not just to understand royal duty but to fulfill it with grace and competence. As midnight approached and 2025 drew to its close, grandfather and grandson found themselves alone in the king's private study, surrounded by the red dispatch boxes, official papers, and constitutional documents that represented the daily reality of modern monarchy. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of New Year celebrations beginning across London, marking the transition from a year of unprecedented learning to whatever challenges 2026 might bring. "What have you learned this year, George?" Charles asked, settling into his favorite chair with the weariness of someone who had carried constitutional responsibility through genuine crisis and personal challenge. The question was both simple and profound, asking the young prince to articulate insights that would shape his approach to leadership for decades to come. George's response demonstrated the maturity he had gained through months of intensive royal education. "I learned that duty isn't about power but about service," he began, his voice carrying new confidence and depth. "I learned that being king means thinking about what's best for everyone, not just what's easy or popular. I learned that people depend on us to be steady and reliable, especially when everything else feels uncertain." He paused, gathering thoughts that reflected genuine understanding rather than rehearsed answers. "I learned that wearing the crown means accepting responsibility for things you can't control, making difficult decisions when every choice has costs, and caring more about doing what's right than about being comfortable or safe." Charles listened with the pride of a grandfather and the satisfaction of a monarch who had successfully passed crucial wisdom to his successor. The young man sitting across from him was still very much a 12-year-old boy, but he was also something more, a future king who understood the weight and wonder of constitutional service, someone prepared to carry forward traditions that connected past to future while adapting to contemporary challenges. The final lesson of 2025 came in the form of a private letter that Charles had written to George throughout the year, recording thoughts and observations about their shared journey of discovery. He presented it as Big Ben struck midnight, marking not just the end of a calendar year but the completion of the most intensive royal education any heir had ever received. "This letter contains everything I hope to teach you about monarchy, duty, and service," Charles said, handing the sealed envelope to his grandson. "But, more importantly, it records what you taught me about courage, curiosity, and the importance of asking the right questions. You made me a better king this year, George, just as I hope I helped prepare you to be an excellent one when your time comes." As fireworks lit up the London sky and crowds celebrated in the streets below, the current king and future king sat quietly in the study that had witnessed so many crucial moments in British constitutional history. They had shared a year that neither would ever forget, a year when duty had been tested and proven resilient, when tradition had demonstrated its continuing relevance, when the monarchy had shown its capacity to serve effectively in a rapidly changing world. The year 2025 would be remembered in royal history as the time when Prince George truly began his journey toward kingship, guided by a grandfather whose own commitment to constitutional service had never wavered despite unprecedented challenges. They had faced international crises, security threats, personal illness, and political complexity together, learning from each experience and growing stronger through shared understanding of what it meant to serve something larger than themselves. As the new year began, both understood that George's education in royal duty would continue for many years to come. But the foundation had been laid, the essential lessons had been learned, and the character had been formed that would one day enable him to wear the crown with the same dignity, wisdom, and unshakable commitment to service that his grandfather had demonstrated throughout the remarkable year of 2025. The monarchy had proven its continuing relevance by meeting contemporary challenges with ancient wisdom and modern courage, ensuring its vital role in Britain's future while honoring the traditions that connected present to past. Most importantly, the precious responsibility of constitutional service had been successfully passed from one generation to the next, guaranteeing that the crown would continue to serve the nation with dedication and purpose for generations yet to come.